Hi there, this is the first video for the macroeconomic section of the course. Now as we move through this we're going to look at some different economic models to explain the behaviour of the economy, and we're going to look at some approaches the government might adopt to try and improve the economy. But before we start looking at those sorts of things, really we need to understand how you can look at an economy, how you can look at the data which is available, and how you can figure out the strength, the current status, I suppose, of the current economy, and that's what this video is going to do. So we're going to be considering the UK economy, and we're just going to think very quickly about the different ways in which you can look at the economy. These are the sorts of things that that you've kind of frequently find on the news headlines and those sorts of things. These big pieces of data. Now, the first thing to say is that the list of different things that you can look at for an economy is absolutely huge. You don't need to know all of them, but there are a few kind of key ones which really you do need to understand right from the very beginning. Now, one of the first ones that I'm sure you've heard about is GDP. This is kind of a really commonly used piece of data, and also because of the fact that a change in GDP is often referred to as economic growth. So if you hear on the news that the UK economy has grown by 2%, what that means is that GDP in the UK has grown by 2% from last year to this year. So what is GDP? Let's kind of have a look at it in a little bit more detail. So GDP, the three words that make up GDP are gross domestic product. So let's take each of those in turn and think about what each of them means. Gross means the total. So when we talk about gross concepts in economics, we are talking about a total concept. Domestic means within the UK. So the total within the UK, and product is the value of goods and services produced. So what does GDP mean then? GDP means the total value of goods and services produced within the UK. So it's a kind of an important indicator because it gives us the sense of the overall situation of the UK economy, the total amount which is being produced within the UK. Now, another economic indicator that you may well hear about is inflation. Okay, so we may well hear about on the news the fact that inflation in the UK, as I'm creating this presentation, inflation in the UK is 0.5%. In fact, actually, whilst we're doing that, then the current rate of GDP growth in the UK on an annualised basis is 2%. Just so you've got an idea of what we're talking about here. So inflation of 0.5%. What does that mean? That means that there has been an increase in average prices from one year to the next. So what does inflation of 0.5% mean? It means that prices on average, now it's important here to think about these are average prices, not the price of specific products. You shouldn't really talk about a particular product having inflation. Inflation means average prices across the whole economy. So what this means, if we've got inflation of 0.5%, that means that average prices in the UK have gone up by 0.5% since the same time last year. So in practice, that means if something was £100 last year, then on average it would be £100.50 to buy that same product this year. Now 0.5% is very low, both historically for the UK and kind of on an international stage. We'll look at that more as we go through the course, but 0.5% is very low at the moment. You would normally, the Bank of England tries to get that figure to around about 2%, but there are various economies around the world that have inflation of kind of double digits, 10%, 11%, that sort of thing. And in the past, there have been circumstances of hyperinflation where inflation is in the millions of percent. So inflation, though, is just measuring the increase in average prices from one year to the next. Just zoom out just a little bit, give myself a bit more room here. So another one that we may well have heard about is unemployment. So unemployment is obviously, now we're talking about the labour market in a particular country. Now, in the UK, the current rate of unemployment is 4.9%. And again, what we need to think about really is, what does that actually mean? Well, unemployment of 4.9% means the percentage of those willing and able to work without a job. Now, it's important that we include this willing and able bit in the definition there. It's not just the people without a job. Obviously, the people without a job would include everyone that's at school, everyone that's retired, everybody that is unable to work because of illness or disability. It would include, in theory, it would include babies and toddlers. It would include people who've decided not to work so they can stay at home to raise a family, and all those sorts of things. Now, if they're not working for those reasons, then we don't consider them unemployed. We consider them inactive, which is a slightly different thing. And we don't use those to tell us about the strength of the economy, because they didn't choose. They haven't failed to get a job because of the economy. They failed to get a job either because of their age or their health, or because of choice, essentially. So we don't consider those. But unemployment of 4.9% means that 4.9% of those people who do want to work and who are able to work but still can't find a job. So obviously, in an economy, you would generally want that number to be fairly low. 4.9% is quite low historically. That's kind of better than our long run averages, certainly. So on that basis, the UK is doing quite well. Although, as we will see later on when we look at employment, that there are some economists out there that argue that 4.9% is actually makes the economy look better than it actually is. So there are some other indicators as well that we would look at. I'm just going to skim through these a little bit more briefly, because we will look at these a little bit more as we go through the course. One of the ones, and if we give it its full title, it sounds very long, but if we consider the current account on balance of payments, this is an indicator which gives us an idea of how well Britain is doing in terms of its external trade. So if we look at the current account on balance of payments, we might run a surplus or a deficit. If we're running a surplus, that means we are generally exporting more than we're importing, and if we're running a deficit, then we're importing more than we export. Now, the UK for very many years now has run a deficit on the current account of balance of payments. So another thing that we might look at to try and figure out the relative strength of the economy is the government deficit. And this means how much more is the government spending than they are receiving through tax revenue. We may also look at the level of government debt. You may also hear this referred to as sovereign debt. They essentially mean the same thing. Now, those are, to start with at least, the main ways that we can consider the strength of an economy. We will look at more as we go through the course, particularly when we get on into the second year. But these are just some general senses that you can get. Now, what you see is that each of them measures a slightly different thing. None of them is perfect. None of them is comprehensive in terms of what they show us, and we will look at ways in which the information that each of them shows us is slightly limited. But just to go through them very briefly, then you've got GDP, the gross domestic product. That's the total value of everything produced in the economy. You've got inflation, which measures the rate of price increases. You've got unemployment, which is measuring those people who don't have a job but would want one. You've got the current account on balance of payments, which measures our external trade position. And then you've got government deficit and government debt, which tells us about the government finances. And using those indicators together will give us a fairly strong indication of how well an economy is doing.